Black teen fixes stranger's groceries in parking lot. Weeks later, he finds himself standing in a grand hall. The scattered groceries lay across the dark asphalt like fallen soldiers, a carton of eggs bleeding yellow onto the parking lot surface. Mark Thompson, his crisp navy suit now wrinkled from bending down, stared at the torn paper bag with the same defeated expression he'd worn for the past 5 years. In that moment of frustration, he barely noticed the young African-American teenager approaching until a gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "Let me help you with that." Sir, it was a simple gesture that would alter not just 2 lives, but an entire community's destiny. Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness that changed everything? Before we dive into this heartwarming story, take a moment to share where you're watching from and hit that like button. Your story matters too. Mark Thompson sat alone in his penthouse office, the evening skyline of downtown stretching out beyond floor-to-ceiling windows that felt more like prison walls these days. At 52, he had everything money could buy, yet the weight of the past hung heavy on his shoulders. 5 years ago, he'd been more than just another CEO. He was the people's philanthropist, the man whose Thompson Foundation had built schools in underprivileged neighborhoods and funded medical care for thousands of children. Until the accusations came. His trusted partner and friend of 20 years, Robert Maxwell, had orchestrated a masterful plan, framing Mark for embezzling millions from the foundation. The evidence seemed irrefutable: doctored financial statements, fabricated offshore accounts, and a trail of apparent bribes. The media feasted on the story of the fallen humanitarian. Charity champion caught stealing from children. The headline still haunted his dreams. Though eventually cleared of criminal charges, the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Major donors withdrew, the foundation collapsed, and the programs helping thousands of families crumbled. Mark watched helplessly as 2 decades of work vanished in months. The worst part wasn't losing his reputation or the foundation, it was losing faith in humanity. He'd grown up poor in South Chicago, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs. His own success story had fueled his passion for giving back. Now, that same success felt hollow. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had more money than ever, with the corporate side of his business thriving, but the joy of helping others had been poisoned. Mark now spent his days in careful isolation, managing his company through layers of executives, trusting no one. His few personal relationships had withered under the weight of suspicion. Every gesture of kindness seemed to hide an ulterior motive. Every smile appeared to mask deceit. The media had moved on to new scandals, but Mark remained frozen in that moment of betrayal. Even his attempts at anonymous giving were thwarted by guilt and paranoia. Each time he considered restarting his philanthropic work, Maxwell's smirking face appeared in his mind, along with the whispers that had destroyed everything. No one's really that generous. Everyone has an angle. The worst part was he'd started to believe it. The only reminder of his former life sat in his desk drawer, a worn photograph of an elderly man who'd once helped him pay for college textbooks when he couldn't afford them. That stranger's kindness had set him on his path, but now the photo served only to remind him of his failure to pass that kindness forward. Years of therapy had done little to heal the wounds of betrayal. His therapist suggested he was suffering from PTSD, not from the scandal itself, but from the complete shattering of his worldview. The man who once believed in the fundamental goodness of people now saw only shadows and schemes. Into this darkness he retreated each night, to an apartment filled with expensive furniture but devoid of warmth. His closet full of perfectly tailored suits felt like armor against a world he no longer trusted. The awards and recognition from his philanthropic days had long since been packed away, too painful to display but too meaningful to discard. The only thing that kept him going was work, the methodical, predictable world of corporate finance where everything could be measured, verified, and controlled. No messy emotions, no betrayals, just the clean logic of profit and loss. Yet even as his wealth grew, the hole inside him deepened. He was, by all material measures, successful, and by every other measure, utterly lost. In the fading light of autumn, 16-year-old Jamal Washington navigated his way through the South Side's aging streets, backpack heavy with textbooks and dreams even heavier with responsibility. His home was a modest 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his mother, Sarah, a former nurse-turned-hospital custodian after a patient's false accusation had cost her medical license. The walls were thin, but somehow managed to contain an ocean of love and determination. Sarah had raised Jamal alone after his father was wrongfully imprisoned and later died in custody, a victim of a corrupt justice system. Yet she never let bitterness take root in their home. Your father's story isn't your destiny. She would remind him, her voice steady even when her hands trembled with exhaustion after double shifts. At Roosevelt High School, Jamal was a study in contradictions. His perfect GPA and advanced placement scores made him the pride of sympathetic teachers, yet the same achievements marked him as a target. Acting white, some kids sneered. The honors student who tutored younger children for free was the same boy who ate lunch alone, watching others from behind worn paperback copies of law books. The bruises from last week's accident in the locker room were still fading, but Jamal kept them hidden from his mother. She had enough burdens. Besides, he understood his tormentors carried their own pain. Principal Stevens called him an inspiration while doing nothing about the bullying, afraid of disturbing the delicate racial politics of a struggling school. After school, Jamal worked at the local library, shelving books and secretly leaving encouraging notes inside volumes for other kids to find. His meager paycheck went mostly toward a college fund, though lately more of it had been diverted to help neighboring families with groceries or school supplies. He kept a detailed ledger of these small kindnesses, not out of pride but as proof that change was possible, $1 at a time. At night, while his mother slept between shifts, Jamal would often sit by their kitchen window watching the neighborhood. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every family story. There was Mrs. Johnson, raising her grandchildren after losing her daughter to addiction. The Rodriguez twins, whose father worked 3 jobs since their mother's cancer diagnosis. The Chen family's corner store, where Mr. Chen often forgot to charge full price to struggling families. The walls of Jamal's small bedroom told his story newspaper clippings about social justice, acceptance letters from summer programs he couldn't afford to attend, and a single photo of his father in his Sunday best. Below these hung a handwritten list of goals: Harvard Law School, Civil Rights Attorney, Community Center Foundation. Dreams that seemed impossible yet felt like destiny. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, Jamal maintained an unshakable belief in human goodness. Each act of kindness he witnessed or performed was carefully recorded in a worn journal, his own evidence against despair. Light finds cracks in the darkest places, his mother always said, and Jamal had made it his mission to be that light. Few knew that he spent his Sunday mornings reading to elderly residents at the nursing home where his mother worked nights, or that he'd started a quiet revolution of his own, a network of students helping each other with homework, groceries, and hope. In a neighborhood where poverty bred competition, Jamal fostered cooperation. What made him extraordinary wasn't his intelligence or his resilience, though both were remarkable, but his ability to see beyond circumstances to possibilities. Where others saw a crumbling school, he envisioned a future community center. Where others saw rivals, he saw potential allies. In a world that had given him every reason to be bitter, Jamal Washington chose to be brave. The October wind whipped through the Walmart parking lot, sending discarded receipts dancing across the asphalt like urban tumbleweeds. Mark Thompson stood frozen, watching his carefully selected groceries roll in every direction. The paper bag's sudden betrayal seemed like a perfect metaphor for his life, everything falling apart just when you think you have it under control. Organic produce scattered like forgotten promises. A bottle of premium olive oil cracked, its contents seeping into the pavement like golden tears. The evening sun cast long shadows across the scene, turning it into a still life of corporate success meeting mundane disaster. Mark's Italian leather shoes, worth more than most people's weekly salary, now stood in a puddle of spilled almond milk. He hadn't done his own shopping in years, had insisted on it today in some misguided attempt at normalcy. Now he remembered why he usually sent his assistant. As he bent to retrieve a runaway apple, his Armani suit protested with an audible rip. Perfect. Just perfect. That's when he heard footsteps approaching. His body tensed instinctively. 5 years of paranoia had taught him to expect the worst. But instead of threat or mockery, a young voice called out, "Don't worry, sir, I've got this." Before Mark could respond, Jamal Washington was already gathering the scattered items with efficient care. The boy moved with purpose, salvaging what could be saved, carefully separating the damaged goods. "I think we can save most of it," Jamal said, pulling a reusable shopping bag from his backpack. "I always carry extra. Mom says you never know when someone might need help." The simplicity of the statement hit Mark like a physical force. What struck Mark wasn't just the help itself, but the way it was offered without hesitation, without expectation. In his world of calculated moves and hidden agendas, this straightforward kindness felt almost alien. He watched as Jamal meticulously wiped each salvageable item with napkins from his backpack. "You don't have to," Mark began, reaching for his wallet. But Jamal cut him off with a gentle smile. "Please don't, sir. My mom always says a good deed loses its soul when you put a price on it." The words echoed something Mark himself had once believed, long ago, before Maxwell and the scandal. Their hands met briefly as Jamal passed him the reorganized bag. Mark noticed calluses on the boy's fingers, signs of work, of responsibility beyond his years. A library card peeked out from Jamal's pocket, worn and well used. Small details that painted a larger picture. The entire interaction lasted less than 10 minutes, but time seemed to slow. Mark found himself studying the young man's face, the earnest eyes, the quiet dignity, the complete absence of guile that he'd forgotten could exist in the world. Here was someone who helped simply because help was needed. As Jamal turned to leave, Mark caught a glimpse of a bruise partially hidden by his collar. The boy adjusted his shirt quickly, but not before Mark recognized the telltale signs of someone carrying burdens they shouldn't have to bear. "Thank you," Mark said, the words feeling inadequate. Jamal just nodded, already moving away, unaware that his simple act of kindness had cracked something open in the older man's carefully fortified heart. The encounter in the parking lot haunted Mark for days. He found himself replaying every detail: the boy's careful movements, his genuine smile, the quiet dignity that seemed beyond his years. Something about Jamal had pierced the armor Mark had spent years building, stirring memories of his own past, of being that kid who needed help, of becoming the man who gave it. Unable to shake his curiosity, Mark began making inquiries. His corporate resources, usually dedicated to mergers and acquisitions, now turned toward understanding the life of one teenage boy from the South Side. The story that emerged both inspired and troubled him. Jamal Washington, straight a student, library volunteer, unofficial community organizer, and frequent target of bullying at Roosevelt High. More disturbing were the details about Jamal's mother, Sarah Washington, a former nurse with an impeccable record until a wealthy patient's false accusation of theft had cost her her medical license. Now she worked as a custodian at Memorial Hospital, the very place she'd once saved lives. The irony wasn't lost on Mark, another good person punished for their integrity. The deeper Mark dug, the more connections he uncovered. Sarah's current employer, Memorial Hospital, was a subsidiary of Maxwell Healthcare, owned by none other than Robert Maxwell himself. The same man who had destroyed Mark's foundation was now indirectly responsible for Sarah Washington's continued degradation. Late one night, reviewing security footage from his building's lobby, Mark caught a glimpse of something that stopped him cold. Sarah Washington, in her custodian's uniform, emptying trash bins with the same careful attention her son had shown to Mark's Groceries. The timestamp read 2 a.m., a mother working through the night to support her son's dreams. The final piece clicked when Mark discovered Jamal's father's story. Michael Washington had died in prison serving time for a crime he didn't commit, a victim of the same corrupt system that had nearly destroyed Mark. The prosecutor in Michael's case had been on Maxwell's payroll, a fact buried so deep it had taken Mark's best investigators to uncover it. Each revelation felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, one that had been waiting for Mark to solve. He began tracking Maxwell's current operations, finding patterns of corruption that extended far beyond his own scandal. The man hadn't stopped after destroying Mark's foundation. He'd simply moved on to new targets, new lives to ruin. The decision to act crystallized one evening as Mark watched from his car as Jamal tutored younger kids at the library. The boy's patient explanations, his quiet encouragement, the way he slipped extra pencils to students who needed them, it was like watching a younger version of himself before cynicism had taken root. Mark began making plans, not just for a scholarship or a one-time gesture, but for something bigger. Maxwell's empire was built on stolen dreams and broken lives. It was time someone stood up to him, not for revenge, but for justice. The question was how to help without making Jamal and Sarah targets? As if answering his thoughts, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Maxwell Healthcare announced plans to restructure Memorial Hospital staff, with layoffs starting in the custodial department. Time was running out. Mark realized he couldn't stay in the shadows any longer. The same system that had protected Maxwell's crimes could be used to expose them, but only if someone was willing to risk everything again. Jamal deserves a like for his pure heart and kindness, just as his mother Sarah deserves one for her silent sacrifices. Unfortunately, they haven't received the recognition they deserve yet. If you believe in the power of compassion, hit that like button. Sometimes the smallest gestures can spark the biggest changes. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon. Jamal was leaving the library, his mind preoccupied with the college application essays he'd been helping other students perfect. He barely registered the footsteps behind him until it was too late. 5 seniors from the football team, led by Coach Stevens' son Bradley, had decided it was time to teach the smart kid a lesson. The first punch caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. As he fell, Jamal's backpack spilled open, scattering college brochures across the wet pavement. Through the rain of blows, he could hear their taunts. "Think you're better than us. Harvard ain't for people like you going to cry to your convict daddy." They didn't stop until a car horn blared. Jamal lay there, tasting blood, watching through swollen eyes as his attackers fled. The world spun in slow motion as he tried to gather his scattered belongings. His acceptance letter to the Harvard summer program, the one he couldn't afford to attend, was now stained with both rain and blood. Mark Thompson had been driving home when he witnessed the attack's aftermath. He recognized Jamal immediately, the boy's careful movements now painfully slow as he tried to stand. Without thinking, Mark was out of his car, running through the rain. "Don't move," he commanded, already dialing 911. "Help is coming." The hospital waiting room became a battlefield of another sort. Sarah Washington arrived still in her custodian's uniform, her face a mask of contained fury and fear. The community followed elderly residents from the nursing home where Jamal read on Sundays, kids he'd tutored, families he'd quietly helped. Each person had a story about Jamal's kindness. Mark watched from the corner as Sarah argued with hospital administrators about payment. Her employee insurance, it seemed, didn't cover emergency room visits. The same hospital where she cleaned floors wouldn't help her son without a substantial deposit. The irony was bitter enough to taste. Detective Williams took statements, but his expression said it all. Nothing would come of it. "Boys will be boys," he muttered, not meeting Sarah's eyes. The same phrase had been used when they dismissed the complaints about Michael Washington's wrongful arrest years ago. The X-rays revealed 3 cracked ribs, a mild concussion, and a fractured wrist, the same wrist Jamal used to write the essays that might have been his ticket out. The doctor, glancing nervously at the administrators hovering nearby, suggested less ambitious academic pursuits might be safer. Through it all, Jamal remained stoic, more worried about his mother's mischief than his own injuries. "I'm fine, Mom," he kept insisting, though the pain medication made his words slur. "They didn't take anything important. They can't take what's in here." He tapped his head weakly, managing a smile that broke everyone's heart. Mark stood in the doorway of the hospital room, watching this display of quiet courage, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about one act of kindness in a parking lot anymore. This was about a system that punished excellence if it came in the wrong color or from the wrong neighborhood. A system he had once fought against before fear and betrayal had made him retreat. Mark's investigation into Memorial Hospital opened a Pandora's box of corruption. What started as a routine background check revealed a pattern of systematic discrimination and financial fraud that stretched back years. Maxwell hadn't just taken over the hospital, he'd turned it into a machine for laundering money through fake insurance claims and inflated administrative costs. Sarah Washington's demotion from nurse to custodian was just one thread in a larger tapestry of injustice. Her patient's false accusation had been orchestrated by Maxwell's team to silence her after she'd noticed discrepancies in billing practices. The same pattern had played out dozens of times: whistleblowers discredited, careers destroyed, lives ruined, all to protect Maxwell's empire. The evidence was damning: forged documents, falsified medical records, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Mark's team discovered that Maxwell had been using the hospital's charitable foundation, ironically named after Jamal's father, to funnel money into offshore accounts. The same foundation that denied assistance to families like the Washingtons. Late one night, as Mark pored over financial records in his office, a familiar name caught his eye. The prosecutor who'd handled Michael Washington's case had received regular payments from a shell company linked to Maxwell. the same prosecutor who'd suppressed evidence that would have proven Michael's innocence. The connections became clearer with each document. Maxwell had needed a fall guy for a series of fraudulent insurance claims. Michael Washington, an honest hospital administrator who'd started asking questions, had been the perfect target. His death in prison hadn't been an accident, it had been the final act in covering up Maxwell's crimes. Sarah's current situation was part of Maxwell's ongoing strategy: keep the whistleblowers close where they could be watched, break them down slowly with night shifts and minimal pay, make examples of them to discourage others from speaking out. The custodial department was full of former professionals who dared to question the system. Mark recognized the pattern because he'd lived it. Maxwell had used the same tactics to destroy his foundation: fabricated evidence, media manipulation, strategic destruction of reputation. But this time, Maxwell had left a trail. In his arrogance, he'd grown careless, believing himself untouchable. The final piece fell into place when Mark's team uncovered a memo about the upcoming restructuring. The planned layoffs weren't about cutting costs, they were about eliminating potential witnesses before a scheduled Medicare audit. Sarah Washington's name was at the top of the list, along with a note handled the son's situation. The threat to Jamal wasn't random bullying, it was orchestrated. Bradley Stevens' father, the coach who'd ignored the bullying, was on Maxwell's payroll. The attack was meant to send a message: stay quiet, or things will get worse. The same tactics that had silenced so many others. Mark sat back in his chair, the weight of the truth settling around him like a heavy cloak. He had a choice to make. He could walk away, protect himself, let another generation of injustice continue. Or he could step back into the fight, use his resources and influence to expose Maxwell once and for all. But taking on Maxwell meant putting everything at risk again. The next 2 months became a careful dance of gathering evidence and building alliances. Mark worked methodically, using his corporate connections to quietly assemble a team of investigators, lawyers, and former victims of Maxwell's schemes. Each person brought another piece of the puzzle, another story of lives destroyed by systematic corruption. In his penthouse office, now converted into a command center, Mark coordinated with journalists who had once vilified him. Linda Martinez from the Tribune, who'd written the most damaging articles during his scandal, became his strongest ally after seeing the evidence. Sometimes she told him redemption stories are really about justice finding its moment. The hospital's night shift became an unexpected source of intelligence. Sarah Washington, still working as a custodian, began noticing patterns: late-night meetings, suspicious document shredding, mysterious visitors. She'd pass the information to Mark through a complex system of dead drops and encrypted messages, each detail adding to their case against Maxwell. Meanwhile, Mark kept a protective eye on Jamal's recovery. The boy's physical wounds healed faster than the emotional ones, but his spirit remained unbroken. Despite everything, Jamal continued tutoring, now from his hospital bed, helping other students with their college essays via video chat. His quiet determination only strengthened Mark's resolve. Community support grew organically. When word spread about Jamal's attack, local business owners began sharing their own stories of Maxwell's intimidation tactics. The Chen family, whose corner store had been pressured into selling to Maxwell's development company, provided crucial financial records. Mrs. Rodriguez, a former hospital administrator, revealed years of documented irregularities she'd hidden away. Mark's legal team worked around the clock, building an airtight case. They discovered Maxwell's pattern extended beyond the hospital. He'd been systematically targeting community institutions, using a combination of financial pressure and intimidation to build his empire. The same tactics he'd used against Mark's foundation were his standard operating procedure. The hardest part was keeping their investigation secret. Maxwell had eyes everywhere, and the stakes were literally life and death. Mark remembered Michael Washington's fate all too well. He doubled security around Sarah and Jamal, using his corporate resources to ensure their protection without raising suspicion. Local law enforcement proved surprisingly helpful once Mark found the right allies. Detective Williams, haunted by his role in Michael Washington's case, became a valuable inside source. He'd kept copies of suppressed evidence, waiting for the right moment to bring them forward. "I've got a lot to make up for," he admitted. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior accountant at Maxwell Healthcare, inspired by Jamal's story, reached out with copies of falsified Medicare claims. The documents provided the smoking gun they needed, direct evidence of fraud that couldn't be explained away or buried. As their case grew stronger, so did the sense of purpose among those involved. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt businessman, it was about reclaiming a community's right to justice. Every person who joined their cause brought not just evidence, but hope that this time the truth would prevail. During those intense months of investigation, something unexpected began to grow alongside their case against Maxwell, a deep bond between Mark and the Washington family. What started as protection and strategy sessions evolved into shared meals, long conversations, and a genuine connection that surprised them all. Mark found himself spending evenings at the Washingtons' modest apartment, initially under the pretense of reviewing evidence. But soon these visits became about more than the case. He discovered Sarah's passion for medical research, untouched by years of degradation. Her insights into hospital operations proved invaluable, but it was her unwavering dignity that truly impressed him. Jamal's recovery became a journey they shared. Mark attended physical therapy sessions, watched the boy struggle with simple tasks like writing, and witnessed his determination to not let pain define him. During one particularly difficult session, Jamal confided, "Sometimes I think about giving up. Then I remember my dad never did." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. Their relationship evolved naturally. Mark found himself sharing stories about his own troubled past, his childhood in poverty, the stranger who'd helped him afford college, his early days of philanthropy. Jamal listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed wisdom beyond his years. Maybe he suggested one evening, "Everything that happened was preparing you for this moment." Sarah watched this growing bond with mixed emotions. She recognized Mark's genuine care for Jamal, but feared the cost of hope. Too many times she'd seen promises broken, help withdrawn. Yet something about Mark's presence felt different. Perhaps it was the way he treated Jamal, not as a charity case, but as a son. The transformation in Mark became evident to those who knew him. The cynicism that had defined him post-scandal began to crack. His executive assistant noted he'd started smiling again. Board members commented on his renewed energy. Even his therapist remarked on the change. "You're not just fighting against something anymore. You're fighting for someone." Jamal's influence extended beyond their personal connection. His resilience inspired Mark to reconnect with his foundation's former beneficiaries. Many had struggled after its collapse, yet they harbored no bitterness. Their stories of perseverance despite setbacks helped heal Mark's old wounds. Together, they began dreaming bigger than just exposing Maxwell. They talked about rebuilding the foundation, creating scholarships, establishing a legal aid clinic. Jamal's vision of community service aligned perfectly with Mark's rediscovered purpose. "We're not just fixing what's broken," Jamal said. "We're building something better." The most profound changes were internal. Mark stopped seeing himself as a victim of betrayal and recognized his role as a protector and mentor. Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future beyond survival. And Jamal, despite his injuries, grew stronger in spirit, understanding that his story could inspire others. One evening, as they shared dinner in the Washington's small kitchen, Mark realized something fundamental had shifted. He wasn't just fighting Maxwell for justice anymore, he was fighting for family. The empty penthouse he'd once retreated to now felt less like home than this warm, cramped apartment filled with love and purpose. The scholarship ceremony was set for a crisp November morning at Roosevelt High's auditorium. Everything had been carefully orchestrated: the press invitations, the community leaders in attendance, the timing of revelations. Mark stood backstage, adjusting his tie, knowing that Maxwell wouldn't be able to resist such a public event. The audience filled every seat: students, teachers, local residents, and carefully placed members of Mark's investigative team. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her old nurse's pin, a small act of defiance. Jamal, still bearing faint bruises but standing tall, waited in the wings with a speech that would change everything. Maxwell arrived exactly as predicted, flanked by security and wearing his trademark smirk. He took his place in the VIP section, clearly relishing what he thought would be another opportunity to witness the suffering he'd caused. Behind him sat Bradley Stevens and his father, the coach, both looking uncomfortable but trapped in their roles. Mark began his address with practiced ease, speaking about community, opportunity, and second chances. The scholarship announcement drew appropriate applause, a full ride to Harvard Law School for Jamal Washington. But when Mark continued speaking, revealing the scholarship would be awarded through the newly established Michael Washington Justice Foundation, Maxwell's smile faltered. What followed was a masterpiece of public exposure. With precise timing, Linda Martinez from the Tribune began live streaming. Detective Williams positioned himself near the exits. Mark methodically laid out the evidence: the fraudulent Medicare claims, the falsified records, the systematic destruction of lives, including Michael Washington's. The audience watched in stunned silence as Mark projected document after document onto the screen behind him. Bank records showing payments to the prosecutor in Michael's case. Medical records proving Sarah's patient had been coached to make false accusations. Security footage of Bradley Stevens receiving instructions before Jamal's attack. Maxwell stood up, face contorted with rage, but found himself surrounded by federal agents who'd been posing as maintenance workers. Coach Stevens tried to run but was stopped by parents of students he'd allowed to be bullied. His son Bradley, faced with the truth about his father's corruption, broke down and began confessing everything. Linda Martinez's livestream captured it all: Maxwell's arrest, the public vindication of Sarah Washington, the community's reaction as years of injustice were exposed. But the most powerful moment came when Jamal took the stage, still walking with a slight limp, and addressed his tormentors directly. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because hate takes too much energy from those who carry it." Mark watched as the truth rippled through the audience. Hospital staff members stood up one by one, adding their testimonies. Former victims of Maxwell's schemes emerged from the crowd to tell their stories. The auditorium became a courtroom of public opinion, with justice finally being served in the light of day. The ceremony transformed into something more profound than a scholarship announcement. It became a moment of community catharsis, a public reckoning with years of systematic corruption. As Maxwell was led away in handcuffs, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not for his arrest, but for the courage of those who had finally stood up to him. The aftermath of Maxwell's arrest exploded across national media with unprecedented force. Within hours, Justice Washington was trending, accompanied by clips of Jamal's powerful speech and Maxwell's very public downfall. The story touched a nerve, becoming a symbol of both systemic corruption and the power of community resistance. Maxwell's empire began crumbling within days. Whistleblowers from every level of his organizations came forward, each revelation more damning than the last. The Medicare fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators uncovered a decades-long pattern of corruption that stretched from local hospitals to international money laundering schemes. Sarah Washington's reinstatement as head nurse became a viral moment of its own. Security cameras captured her walking through Memorial Hospital's halls, removing her custodian's uniform for the last time as staff lined the corridors applauding. The image of her pinning on her nurse's badge, tears streaming down her face, appeared on newspaper front pages nationwide. But Maxwell wasn't going down without a fight. His legal team launched aggressive counterattacks, attempting to paint Mark as a vengeful competitor and the Washingtons as opportunists. Conservative media outlets picked up this narrative, questioning Jamal's convenient timing and suggesting the whole event was orchestrated for political gain. The pressure on those involved became intense. Mark's corporate board threatened to remove him, concerned about the company's stock price amid the controversy. Sarah faced harassment from Maxwell's remaining loyalists at the hospital. Jamal received death threats requiring police protection at school. Social media became a battlefield of competing narratives. While many celebrated the exposure of corruption, others questioned everything from Jamal's academic credentials to Sarah's original dismissal. The same platforms that had amplified their triumph now magnified every doubt and criticism. Bradley Stevens' confession sparked its own controversy. His detailed account of how Maxwell's organization had manipulated vulnerable teenagers into becoming enforcers sent shockwaves through the education system. Other schools began investigating similar patterns, revealing a network of corruption targeting underprivileged communities. The hardest blow came when Maxwell's team leaked personal details about the Washington family. Old court records, financial struggles, even Sarah's private medical history. Nothing was off limits. The media circus threatened to overshadow the real issues, turning a story of justice into tabloid fodder. Yet through it all, the community held firm. Local businesses refused to advertise, with networks spreading Maxwell's version of events. Students organized walkouts when school administrators tried to distance themselves from the scandal. The very people Maxwell had once terrorized now stood united against his attempts at intimidation. The turning point came when Maxwell's own son, witnessing Jamal's forgiveness of his attackers, decided to testify against his father. His insider account of years of manipulation and abuse provided the final evidence needed to ensure Maxwell's conviction. Sometimes, as Mark observed, redemption comes from unexpected places. As this story unfolds, we see how one act of kindness can spark a revolution of justice. If you believe in the power of truth and redemption, consider subscribing to our channel. Together, we'll continue sharing stories that remind us why humanity and hope matter. Your support makes these stories possible. The price of justice began to mount in unexpected ways. Mark's newly established Michael Washington Justice Foundation came under intense scrutiny from regulatory agencies, clearly influenced by Maxwell's remaining allies. Every grant, every scholarship, every transaction was questioned, creating administrative nightmares that threatened to paralyze their work. Sarah's return to nursing faced subtle but persistent resistance. While officially reinstated, she discovered her medical decisions questioned, her schedules manipulated, and her patient reports mysteriously altered. The old guard at Memorial Hospital, many still loyal to Maxwell, waged a quiet war of bureaucratic harassment. Jamal struggled with the weight of becoming a symbol. His every move was scrutinized, his past combed through for flaws. The pressure to be perfect, to justify the faith placed in him, began affecting his grades. Nightmares about the attack returned, accompanied by anxiety attacks that he tried desperately to hide from his mother. The financial toll grew steep. Mark's personal fortune, once seemed inexhaustible, began draining rapidly. Legal fees, security costs, and the expense of protecting witnesses mounted. His corporate board, concerned about the company's image, forced him to step down as CEO, cutting off his main source of income. Anonymous threats escalated. Mark's car was vandalized, with photos of Michael Washington's prison cell left on the windshield. Sarah found her nursing credentials questioned by mysterious complaints to the licensing board. Even Mrs. Chen's corner store was targeted, with health inspectors suddenly finding violations that had never existed before. The media narrative began to shift. Stories appeared questioning Mark's motives, suggesting he was using the Washingtons to rebuild his reputation. Old allegations about his foundation resurfaced, carefully worded to imply that perhaps Maxwell had been right all along. Each news cycle brought fresh attacks on their credibility. Local support wavered as the cost of standing against Maxwell became clear. Business owners who had spoken out found their permits delayed, their loans denied. Parents who had backed Jamal worried about their own children's college prospects. The community's initial unity showed signs of fracturing under sustained pressure. Detective Williams, their key ally in law enforcement, was found unconscious in his home, an apparent accident that left him in a coma. The message was clear: Maxwell's network reached far beyond his immediate organization. Even from behind bars, he could strike at those who opposed him. Mark watched helplessly as his vision of justice threatened to crumble. The foundation's scholarship programs were frozen pending investigation. Their legal aid clinic faced eviction. The very systems they had hoped to reform were being used as weapons against them. Each night, alone in his increasingly empty penthouse, he'd sold most of his art and furniture to fund the legal battle. Mark questioned whether he had done more harm than good. The weight of responsibility for the suffering he'd brought to the Washingtons and their supporters felt crushing. The darkest hour came on a rainy December evening. Sarah collapsed during her shift at Memorial Hospital, the culmination of months of stress, harassment, and exhaustion. The same emergency room where she had once saved countless lives now became her refuge, with Jamal holding her hand as doctors diagnosed severe exhaustion and dangerous stress levels. Mark arrived at the hospital to find Jamal sitting alone in the waiting room, shoulders bent under the weight of too many responsibilities. The boy's college acceptance letters lay unopened in his backpack, dreams temporarily set aside while dealing with immediate survival. The sight of this brilliant young man, forced to put his future on hold, hit Mark harder than any financial loss. That same night, Maxwell's lawyers filed a motion to seize the foundation's assets, claiming they were funded with disputed resources. The timing seemed deliberately cruel, threatening to destroy not just their work but the hopes of dozens of scholarship recipients who depended on their support. The community began showing signs of fracture. At a town hall meeting, former supporters publicly questioned whether the fight was worth the cost. A mother whose daughter had received one of their scholarships tearfully withdrew her support, citing threats to her family's business. The solidarity that had sustained them started crumbling under relentless pressure. Bradley Stevens, whose testimony had been crucial, attempted suicide after weeks of cyberbullying and social isolation. Though he survived, his withdrawal from the case dealt a severe blow to their legal strategy. His father, the coach, used the incident to paint himself as a victim of Mark's vendetta, gaining sympathy from unexpected quarters. Mark's personal life disintegrated completely. His remaining board members demanded his resignation from all company positions. His engagement ended when his fiancée couldn't handle the stress and public scrutiny. Even his therapist suggested he consider whether his obsession with justice had become self-destructive. The local press, once supportive, began running stories about the collateral damage of their crusade. Photos of Sarah in her hospital bed leaked online, accompanied by cruel speculation about her competence as a mother. Jamal's academic records were mysteriously leaked with anonymous posts questioning his achievements. Detective Williams remained in a coma, his family facing mounting medical bills that insurance refused to cover. The message was clear: standing up for justice carried a price that few could afford to pay. Each new casualty added to the growing sense that they were fighting an unwinnable war. One particularly cruel blow came when Maxwell's team uncovered and publicized Mark's private therapy sessions, revealing his doubts and fears about the entire mission. The media feasted on his vulnerability, questioning whether his savior complex had dragged innocent people into a personal vendetta. In her hospital room, Sarah finally voiced what many were thinking: maybe the cost is too high. The words hung in the air like poison, as Jamal and Mark sat silently, each wrestling with their own guilt and uncertainty. The dream of justice seemed to be drowning in a sea of consequences none of them had fully anticipated. The tide turned with a series of anonymous emails that flooded every major news outlet simultaneously. Internal documents, security footage, recorded conversations, an avalanche of evidence revealing the full scope of Maxwell's operation. The source was untraceable, but the information was undeniable, authenticated by multiple independent experts. The most damning revelations came from Maxwell's private servers, detailed records of systematic intimidation, bribery, and murder spanning decades. Each file was meticulously organized, a testament to Maxwell's arrogance in documenting his own crimes. The evidence included videos of him ordering Michael Washington's prison accident and orchestrating Sarah's professional destruction. Former employees began speaking out, their silence broken by the sheer volume of evidence now public. Maxwell's personal assistant revealed recordings of him bragging about destroying Mark's foundation. Hospital administrators confessed to falsifying records under pressure. Even Maxwell's private security team turned against him, providing details of surveillance operations against the Washingtons. The FBI's investigation took on new urgency as connections to political corruption emerged. Maxwell's network extended into law enforcement, judiciary, and local government. The same officials who had protected him now faced federal indictments. The system he had manipulated for so long began crumbling under the weight of truth. Detective Williams awakened from his coma with crucial information. Before his accident, he had discovered Maxwell's connection to a series of suspicious deaths in the hospital. His detailed notes, hidden with a trusted colleague, provided the missing links prosecutors needed to build an airtight case. Bradley Stevens, inspired by the flood of revelations, found new courage. From his rehabilitation center, he recorded a detailed confession about his father's role in Maxwell's operation. His testimony, combined with the leaked documents, exposed how Maxwell had systematically recruited troubled teenagers as enforcers. The media narrative shifted dramatically. Journalists who had questioned Mark's motives now praised his resilience. Stories emerged about other lives Maxwell had destroyed, creating a tapestry of corruption that validated every claim the Washingtons had made. Public opinion swung decisively in their favor. Maxwell's remaining allies began distancing themselves. His legal team resigned en masse as evidence of their complicity surfaced. Board members at his companies rushed to cooperate with authorities. The empire he had built through fear and manipulation collapsed like a house of cards. The source of the leaks remained a mystery until a junior technician at Maxwell Healthcare came forward. She had been secretly gathering evidence for years, inspired by her own mother's experience as one of Maxwell's victims. Her methodical documentation provided the foundation for dozens of criminal charges. The final piece fell into place when Maxwell's personal diary was discovered, containing detailed entries about his vendetta against both Mark and the Washington family. His written admission of orchestrating Michael's death and Jamal's attack left no room for doubt. Justice, long delayed, could no longer be denied. The vindication came swiftly and completely. In a historic press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse, the U.S. attorney announced a 147-count indictment against Maxwell and his associates. The charges range from racketeering to first-degree murder, with Michael Washington's death now officially classified as a premeditated killing. Sarah's reinstatement to her nursing position was upgraded to Chief of Emergency Services at Memorial Hospital. Her years of custodial work counted toward seniority. The hospital board, eager to distance themselves from Maxwell's legacy, created a patient advocacy program in her name, focusing on medical care for underserved communities. Jamal's Harvard acceptance became a national story of triumph over adversity. The university, impressed by his resilience and leadership during the crisis, offered him an expanded scholarship covering not just law school but also a concurrent master's in public policy. His story inspired a wave of similar programs at other institutions. Mark's former foundation was not only restored but expanded, with major donors rushing to support its mission of combating systemic corruption. His corporate board, faced with overwhelming public support for his actions, issued a formal apology and offered him reinstatement as CEO with full autonomy to pursue social justice initiatives. Bradley Stevens, following months of therapy, became an unexpected ally in youth rehabilitation. His testimony about Maxwell's manipulation of vulnerable teens led to the creation of a groundbreaking intervention program. The boy who had once attacked Jamal now worked to prevent others from falling into similar traps. Detective Williams made a full recovery and was promoted to head a new anti-corruption task force. His investigation methods became a model for departments nationwide. The same evidence that had nearly cost him his life now served as training material for a new generation of investigators. The community that had wavered under pressure found its strength renewed. Local businesses that had suffered for supporting the Washingtons received an outpouring of public support. The town hall meetings, once sites of division, became forums for healing and rebuilding. Maxwell's empire was systematically dismantled, its assets redirected to compensate victims and fund community programs. The hospital's fraudulent billing scheme was exposed, leading to millions in refunds to overcharged patients. Every institution he had corrupted underwent thorough reform. Linda Martinez's coverage of the case won a Pulitzer Prize, but she gave her monetary award to a scholarship fund for investigative journalism students from underprivileged backgrounds. Her series of articles about the case became required reading in journalism schools across the country. The most powerful moment came when Sarah and Jamal visited Michael's grave together with Mark. "Your death wasn't in vain," Dad Jamal said softly. "Your courage started a chain reaction that finally brought down the whole corrupt system." Sarah placed her restored nurse's pin on the headstone, a symbol of promises kept and justice served. 5 years after Maxwell's conviction, the Michael Washington Justice Center opened its doors in the heart of Southside Chicago. The modern glass building, funded by Mark's restored foundation, housed a comprehensive support system for victims of systemic corruption, legal aid clinics, counseling services, education programs, and a state-of-the-art medical facility. Sarah Washington oversaw the medical wing, implementing innovative programs that combined healthcare with social justice. Her patient advocacy model became a blueprint for hospitals nationwide. Under her leadership, the center developed groundbreaking approaches to treating trauma survivors, particularly those who had faced institutional discrimination. Jamal, now in his final year at Harvard Law School, split his time between classes and directing the center's youth programs. His academic success was matched by his commitment to mentoring others. The study rooms were always filled with students receiving the same kind of tutoring he had once provided in the library, creating a new generation of community leaders. Mark found a different kind of peace in his role as the center's chairman. The corporate world that had once consumed him now served merely as a means to fund their expanding mission. His office walls, once bare, displayed photos of success stories, former victims who had become advocates, students who had overcome barriers, families rebuilt from the ashes of injustice. The center's impact rippled through the community. Former gang members trained as paralegals. Struggling parents found support and resources. Young people discovered opportunities they never knew existed. The building itself, with its open design and welcoming spaces, stood as a physical rejection of the shadows where corruption had once thrived. Detective Williams, now retired, volunteered as a consultant, training a new generation of investigators in ethical law enforcement. His anti-corruption protocols, developed from lessons learned during the Maxwell case, became standard procedure in police departments across the country. The same system that had once protected corruption now worked actively to expose it. Bradley Stevens found his calling running the center's youth intervention program. His first-hand experience with manipulation and redemption gave him unique insight into helping troubled teens. The boxing gym in the basement, where he taught discipline and self-respect, became a safe haven for young people struggling with anger and confusion. Linda Martinez established a journalism fellowship at the center, teaching investigative reporting techniques to aspiring writers from underserved communities. Her students' exposes of continuing corruption appeared regularly in major publications, carrying forward the legacy of truth telling that had brought down Maxwell. The center's success inspired similar initiatives across the country. Other cities sought to replicate its integrated approach to justice and healing. Foundations that had once focused solely on traditional charity now incorporated systemic change into their missions, recognizing that true justice required transforming the systems that enabled corruption. Most importantly, the center stood as living proof that one act of kindness, a teenager helping a stranger in a parking lot, could spark a revolution of justice that transformed countless lives. Its motto, inscribed in the lobby, reads simply, "Kindness is the first act of resistance." On a warm spring morning, 10 years after their first meeting in that fateful parking lot, Mark and Jamal stood together at a Harvard Law School graduation ceremony. Jamal, now Dr. Washington, had just delivered the commencement address, his words echoing the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Justice isn't just about punishing wrong, it's about creating systems that make doing right easier than doing wrong. Sarah watched from the audience, her nurse's pen gleaming alongside her own recently acquired PhD in public health policy. Her research on the intersection of healthcare and social justice had revolutionized hospital administration nationwide. The woman who had once cleaned floors in silence now consulted for major healthcare institutions, ensuring other voices wouldn't be silenced. The Michael Washington Justice Center had spawned a network of similar facilities across the country, each adapting its model to local needs while maintaining the core principle of integrated support. What had started as one building in Chicago had become a movement, with centers operating in 30 states and growing. Mark's corporate empire had transformed as well. His companies now included mandatory ethics oversight and whistleblower protection programs. The business world that had once shunned him for his idealistic approach now studied his methods as profits soared alongside social impact. He had proved that conscience and commerce could coexist. Their story became embedded in popular culture, inspiring books, documentaries, and even a feature film. But more importantly, it became a case study in law schools and business programs, teaching future leaders about the power of ethical leadership and the importance of standing up against systemic corruption. The ripple effects continued to surprise them. Former Maxwell employees, inspired by the center's work, established support groups for corporate whistleblowers. Bradley Stevens' youth intervention program expanded internationally, helping troubled teens find purpose through community service. Detective Williams' anti-corruption protocols became part of standard police training nationwide. Perhaps most significantly, the culture of silence that had protected corruption began to crack. Each year brought new cases of individuals and communities standing up against institutional wrongdoing, often citing the Washington case as their inspiration. The fear that had once paralyzed victims gave way to a new confidence in the possibility of justice. Linda Martinez's journalism fellowship produced a new generation of investigative reporters committed to exposing corruption. Their stories appeared regularly in major publications, each one carrying forward the legacy of truth-telling that had brought down Maxwell. The power of the press to effect change was being renewed. As Jamal concluded his commencement speech, he shared the lesson that had started with a simple act of kindness. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes it starts with simply helping someone pick up their groceries. Because in that moment, you declare that kindness matters more than fear, that community matters more than comfort, that doing right matters more than doing what's easy. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for Jamal, it was for every person who had ever chosen to stand up, speak out, or reach down to help someone else up. In that moment, they all understood that their story wasn't ending, it was just beginning a new chapter in the endless struggle for justice and human dignity. As we conclude this powerful story of justice and transformation, we'd love to hear how it resonated with you. If you believe in the power of storytelling to inspire change, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of hope. Share this video with friends and family who need to be reminded that kindness can change lives. Drop a comment below about your thoughts and feelings. Did Jamal's journey touch your heart? Should we continue with part 2 to explore what happens next at the Justice Center? Your support helps us share more stories that matter. Let's spread hope together.